Thanks for your flexibility. Those of you that are here, some of you I'm looking over, I'm like 8 o'clock, 9:30, and everywhere in between. So it's a great opportunity to get to know each other. And to also those people online, Happy New Year. One of the things that as we start off for today, I want you to think about, have you ever had to take care of something for someone? Pretty much just about every one of us, right? And for some of you, it could seem like a great honor. Others of you, it could be an anxious moment, whether it's a plant and you tend to kill plants like I do, or a goldfish or a pet or something of value. And one of the things that I recall in growing up, and one of the lessons that I learned is that my grandpa had an old Brownie camera, and I was entrusted to watch this camera. And I could take 4 pictures with this little camera. And I was so excited about it until I got distracted. We're over at Marineland, and right near where I used to live, and actually ended up working there for a time. And I left it, and it must have got pushed between the bushes. And I'm going around doing stuff, and all of a sudden, when they wanted to take a picture, ruh-roh, I didn't have it. And so this was the one, my grandpa didn't have a lot of possessions. And I all of a sudden felt so terrible. At 8 years old, the world was crushing upon me, and I had failed miserably. I spent the next, I thought it was 4 days, but it actually was probably about 10 minutes of just anxiety, going around to all the places until I found where it was. And I was like, whew. But I'll tell you, I learned a lesson there about there's certain things that you have to be responsible for, and it's contingent upon the value of the person that's entrusting it to you. I was I was very negligent. Let's not say a little negligent. And again, I'm like, who would trust an 8-year-old with that? But you know what? It's something that for each one of us, we have to think those are human things. But think for a moment of how do you respond, though, when God says, take care of this? I'm gonna give this to you until I come back. And we'll see in our main text today in the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30, we're going to do a launching point, because one of the things as we work through these particular things is that we're going to talk about stewardship. Now, I know what you're thinking, like, oh boy, here's the money talk. Well, right there, it shows you how misunderstood, because stewardship is more than money. See, and if you're taking notes, we've got some sermon notes for you. You could put this down as it comes up on the screen. Is that first I want to mention this, is that stewardship is based on relationship. It's based on relationship. Anything that we have, it's based on relationship. So if we're talking about, from Scripture, biblical stewardship, it's a relationship that we have with God. Now, so here's the relationship. There's a master and a servant, or also known as a steward. The master has resources that he gives to a servant that they can use for their benefit, but it is with a purpose, and eventually they're going to have to give an account for it. The servant, or the steward, receives resources, gets to use those, but ultimately will have to give an account for the way that they use those resources. So that's what we're going to be going over today. So stewardship is based on a relationship, but then you have to think like, okay, well then what's stewardship? Okay, so we're gonna take a macro view and look at stewardship, and you'll see this, that stewardship is basically an act of overseeing God's resources in a manner that, get this, there's 4 things, right? In a manner that's wise, diligent, loving, and just. And so not just our financial or our possessions that we're going to talk about, but other resources that God has entrusted to us, that we're going to oversee these resources that he's given, that we're going to do that in a wise, diligent, loving, and just manner. And I want that to permeate our discussion this morning as we look at what does it mean to be good stewards of that which God has entrusted to us. Because really, stewardship is an act of worship. What are we doing with what God has given us? And so we'll also notice that these things will help us in our pursuit of living our purpose here at Cornerstone of loving God and others well. How do we steward all the resources that God has given us, that we oversee his resources in a way that is wise, diligent, loving, and just? And so I want you to think about those things as we get into the first passage. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning. Obviously, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the talents that Jesus gives. And we're going to look at that rather briefly, but then I'm going to move on to a few other things that we should be stewarding for God's glory, for the benefit of others, as well as for our own benefit. So if you're there, I'm going to just read the first part, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 19. And I kindly ask that if you are able, that you would stand for the reading of God's word. Some of your translations will say talents or bag of money. As I'm going through the NIV here, it says Jesus is speaking. Again, it'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. Thank you. You may be seated. So, in this very familiar story of the talents, and depending on, again, your translation, the talents or the gold, the amount that the master has given, notice that he says, take care of this till I return. He gives property and he gives money. Now, a talent at that time would be about roughly 20 years' wages for a laborer. So if you're thinking the guy with 5 talents or bags of gold, that's an amazing amount. Even the one with 1 talent or 1 bag of gold has, you could tell the generosity of the master. So we think so much about what each person got, and we don't see the generosity of the master to leave this at their disposal. So look again, servants 1 and 2 at once, they go and they make the same amount that they were entrusted. And yet servant number 3 does nothing, buries it, and then they have to give an account. Now, the context as we start looking at this is that Jesus in the Olivet Discourse is giving 4 parables about his second coming, about being prepared for his second coming. And yet, as the master comes back, as you see in verse 19, every person, every servant now has to give an account to what the master has given them. Let's pick up the rest of the story. Notice in verse 20. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I know that you're a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You know, we sure like the beginning of that parable, don't we? And you get to that back, and the last part, and you're like, whoa. So obviously in Jesus' parable, not every servant is following Jesus, is doing what Jesus wants, of what the master wants, with using the master's resources. Who gets to go into paradise and who gets to go into eternal punishment? But as we look at this particular parable, obviously you see servants 1 and 2, they receive praise, right? Well done, good and faithful servant. But also promise. I'm going to give you more. You've shown trustworthy with what I've given you. I'm going to give you more. And then, of course, then there's that offer of paradise. Enter into your master's joy. Happy master, happy servants. And so, but not so with the third. Look again at the third, and what does he mention? He comes up with excuses. And then he also makes an accusation, doesn't he? He talks about how hard the master is. So what did he receive? Obviously a stern rebuke and punishment. But why? Because it stems from his attitude about the master, which ultimately led to his laziness and his bad stewardship of what God had given him. Now, again, going back to the context of this whole parable, Jesus is wanting his followers to be prepared for when he comes back. This idea of the master being Jesus, who's going on a journey. We don't know when he's coming back, but when he comes back, we have to give an account for that which he's told us to take care of. Things to use for his purposes, but also our enjoyment. And so as we look through this, we see that the point of parable is not the amount that was earned, but in faithful responsibility to live up to one's potential and giftedness. That faithfulness is service that's mindful of Jesus coming back. Because Jesus is coming back. We got to 2023 and we're like, whoa, we're that much closer to Jesus coming back. It kind of messes with our minds, right? Starts with our checkbooks and other things, or our assignments in school when we start writing 2022, 3, and we get mixed up with the year. It's moving along, but guess what? That much closer to Jesus coming back. So the question is, are we ready? Are we ready, especially with the resources that he's given to us, that we can say, look, Master, this is what I've done with what you've given me. Now, my hope here is to inspire and not to make any of us feel guilty. We're not talking about any New Year's resolutions. We're not. But one of the things we have to look at is that how do we steward? If we do a reset button on the first of the year, we start thinking about how am I using the resources that God's given me, then it makes us pause to think about that in a more personal level. And since we're waiting for Jesus' return, we should be mindful and productive of what he's entrusted to us. So I want you to think about this for the time as we go through 4 particular things that I'm going to point out. Is what do you do with what you have? See, what you do with what you have says a lot about your priorities. What I do with what I have says a lot about my priorities when it comes to like my time, my talents, my treasures, those things, right? It says something about me. So in some ways, it's a wake-up call, but it's also spurs us to action to say, what am I doing with what I have? And so the question here is, what do we need to do to be good stewards? And so there are 4 particular things that I'm going to mention. There are other things, but 4 things in our brief time today of what it means to be good stewards. The first you'll notice is this, as it comes up on the screen, is that we're called to be good stewards of treasures. We're called to be good stewards of treasures. Now you're like, Mike, why didn't you just put money? Well, it doesn't roll off the tongue as well as all the other things, but here's the other thing. Treasures are finances and possessions. Treasure sounds funny because it sounds, so magical. We're going on a quest for treasure. But you and I have treasure. I want you to say that. Say that with me. I have treasure. I have treasure. Now, you might say, I don't know what it is, but everything we have, because Jesus mentions about that, right? He mentions about it in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. Where your treasure is, there is your heart also. So those things that we value, especially when it comes to finances and possessions. Matter of fact, that if you look through Scripture, about 2,350 times the Bible talks about money or possessions. Jesus talked more about money and possessions than he did about heaven and hell because he knew how much that rivals the human heart. Even if you go to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, where you see that verse about treasure in verse 21, later on when he talks about how God provides for us, he finishes by saying in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things, that is food, drink, clothing, those things that your Father knows you need, you'll get. But we don't think of what we have as treasure because you might not live in a palace or a castle. But we're called to be good stewards of the finances and the possessions that we have. So how are we using those? One of the things years ago, and there are a lot of great financial Bible studies. I remember here at church, we went through Howard Dayton's Crown Bible Study. And one of the verses that we had to memorize was David's prayer in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. And so as you look at that, 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 11 and 12. This is David's prayer. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. What an encompassing thing that says everything that we have is from you. When we give to you, Lord, we're giving back to what you've given to us. Think about it. When we do an offering each week, we are giving to the Lord's work. Through Cornerstone Bible Church. We're giving to foreign and local missions. We're giving to the upkeep of the buildings and the staff. We're giving to programs that are about proclaiming the gospel and helping people to know Jesus Christ and to grow in him. We support other endeavors of supporting kids through Empowering Lives or Compassion or World Vision, a number of things with our giving. Financial stewardship, yeah, it's important. It's one of the things that God's entrusted to us. So whatever money we have, whether we got it from our job or we got a little bit of Christmas money in our stocking or whatever it is, that's a gift from God. How are we going to use that? Now, as I'm saying this, I want this caveat in there. God gives us the opportunity to personally use the resources he's given us. That's not selfish. There's an area in which God provides for us that we take advantage of to a point. But what are we doing with the finances and possessions that God's given us. I'll give you an aha moment that I had one time at the dinner table with our 4 young kids. One of the kids, can't remember who, was asking for something, and I made the response and said, "Oh, we don't have any money. We don't have any money for that." And, went on with dinner and cleaned up and whatever. And later on, I just thought, we do have money. We're just not choosing to use it for that. So why don't I help to let them know that God is gracious? Because if I say we don't have money for that, their immediate response is, then God's not taking care of us. And that was a wrong, I didn't want to convey that. We do have money, but we're choosing to give in different ways and other things. And so as we think about stewardship, when it comes to the finances, think about, how do you use your finances and possessions for God's purposes? But keeping in mind that you have your own needs. And so in each of these steps, I want you to think about ways that we can grow as good stewards in these particular areas. Going back to the First Chronicles passage, it's like it's either all his or it's all mine, right? There's a mindset there. We have to deal with this tension of, if it's all his, why do I act as if it's all mine? So then I'm not becoming a steward on behalf of somebody else. I'm saying, no, that's mine. And so that gets out of course. So what are some practical tips? Well, let me mention some practical tips for this. Some of this would seem obvious, is that, you can do your own little audit. Some of us are even scared by the word audit. Okay, this is a good thing. But take an account of what you have. If you don't have a budget, start a budget. Look at where your money goes. Sometimes we don't think about how we're nickeled and dimed, and all of a sudden, that extra Starbucks run or this extra thing over there, like, oh. It doesn't mean to be so legalistic, but at least to know, how do I spend my money? How do I save my money? How do I give my money? And so it's really important to be able to do that as an individual, as a couple, as a family. What resources do we have, and how are we using these? And so, it sounds weird to do a possession audit. Sometimes we don't do that without thinking. I go into the garage. What do we sell? What do we trash? What do we give away to the thrift store? Right? So how are we using our possessions? So stewarding our treasures. Well, here's the second thing that I'd like to mention, is that we're called to be good stewards of talents. Now, I get it. This can cause confusion, especially if you're looking at Matthew chapter 25 and you use the words talents for a monetary thing. When we talk about talents here, we're talking about spiritual gifts and skills and influence for God's purposes. For every Christian, God's given us a spiritual gift. That there are certain skills that we have, natural skills, learned skills that we could use for God's purposes. That we have influence that we could use for God's purposes. You see, especially here at Cornerstone Bible Church and at any church, we miss out when people aren't using their spiritual gifts. The very opportunity that people have to steward the gifts that God's given them for God's glory and for the value of others. As it comes on the screen, you'll see this particular verse in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, that says, as each one has received a gift, use it to serve one another as what? Good stewards of God's varied grace. That whoever speaks, as one who speaks the oracles of God, whoever serves as one who serves by the strength of God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. The very fact that you could see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in Romans chapter 12, places where God has determined the gifts of each person, likens it to the body, that the body has many parts. You and I have the opportunity to steward the talents that God has given us. And so as you think about how are you using your talents? How are you doing that, whether it's in your home, in the church, out in your community, out in your school? How are you using the talents that God has given you? So in a practical tip for this, as I mentioned, of doing an influence audit. Now this is going to sound weird, an influence audit. How would I do that? An influence audit is to see how are you using your spiritual gifts? As you think about during the week and during the month, how am I using my spiritual gifts? Am I involved in ministry in my church? Again, this is an invitation, especially to those who probably haven't been using their talents, haven't been stepping out to say, how can I serve at my church? How can I discover what my talents are? If you haven't done a spiritual gifts inventory, by the way, inventories are just descriptions. They don't totally mention all the things that you are, but they are helpful to discovering. But you'll probably see people around you that mention that you have the gift of teaching or the gift of administration or the gift of exhortation, helps, mercy, these different things. We see that in each other. It's an invitation this year to be involved in ministry. Not only how do you steward the treasures that God's given you, how do you steward the talents, the spiritual gifts, the skills that God has given you? There are a lot of opportunities to serve in early childhood ministry, in elementary and with youth, tech and worship, foreign missions and local missions teams. You can go down the line. But here's the thing. You're going to experience so much joy when you're stewarding the gift of finances, when you're stewarding the gift of talents, because you get the sense that you are doing something that makes the master happy. Well, here's a third thing that I want to move to, and this is probably, I'll be honest, one of the hardest ones, is that we're called to be good stewards of time. Oh yeah, time. Some of us have a loose relationship with time. And so when we look at this, I think of Moses' words in Psalm 90, verse 12. As you look at that, Moses says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Now, I'm not saying that old Mo had a day planner, but I'm telling you, it helps to use Google Calendar, iCal, something, whether it's a printed, day planner or on your phone. Again, not to be so legalistic, but have intentional structure. There are 168 hours in the week. How am I using them? Now, you think about the main things we need, right? Work and school, eating and sleeping, hygiene, church, worship, discipleship, chores, laundry. It's not to itemize those things, but just like I mentioned to my kids, you don't have money, I can also say I don't have time. Time's not mine to control, but I do have something of how am I going to steward my time? Now, as I'm saying this, you do have to have time for yourself. That's why God, in creating time, has given us Sabbath rest. Sabbath rest is part of time in God's economy. As we steward time, we have to have those moments of rest. God knows we need it. I always see how somebody else needs it, but I don't see how I need it, right? So it affects community. So how are we stewarding our time? It might be the hardest thing for you as you navigate, how do I have time for God and for myself and for others with all the different things that I have going on? It might not be a bad time to now do a time audit. So here's the practical tip for this one. Do a time audit. Think about how your week has been or what your week will look like. Now, each one is different. Matter of fact, let me take a step back and mention that as we talk about these things, how I'm called to steward what I'm in charge of is not the same thing as you. So I'm not going to transpose what I'm called to upon you. We are called to be good stewards of time, talents, and treasures, no doubt. But how do we do that in a way that honors God, values others? And again, think about that. Maybe it's a need for a day planner. Maybe it's something to look at and to say, I might have time, but I don't have energy. I talk about time and energy management together. I never talk about time management alone. Because we have to look at that and say, okay, how does my body work? Do I have the energy? So these things are all come into play. Well, here's just as we move along to the last one, is that we're called to be good stewards of the earth. Now, you might be going, well, Mike, how does this even fit in? Well, actually, if you go back to Genesis, it's the first thing that we're called to is the dominion mandate, is to care for the earth. Is when we start to look at it, that we are part of creation and we're given dominion over it, that the earth, Adamah, is to be ruled over by Adam, by man, who is part of creation, but is also entrusted to care for it. So if you think about it, that God has handed the planet to us. That's scary. So as we look at this, here's the next verse as we're looking at this particular area. Psalm 115, 16. I mean, obviously, I could take you to Genesis 1 and 2, but simply put, the psalmist says, the highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to mankind. Okay? But I'm not going to go too much into detail on this, but I just want you to think about, this is all born out of a relationship. So if you're taking notes, and I didn't put this up on the screen, but if you just make a triangle, if you make a triangle and you put God at the top of the triangle, put God at the top of the triangle, okay? And then in the bottom right-hand corner, put the earth. So you've got God, the earth, and then put people on the left. So you've got God, earth on the right, people on the left. So you've got God and you've got the earth. So God owns the earth. It's his. It's his. God has a relationship with people, fellowship. We have fellowship with God. But the thing is that people have stewardship of the earth. God owns the earth. We have fellowship with God, but he's called us to steward the earth. And so it's very relational. And so we have to think about this for a moment because there's an alluring temptation for all of us, and especially in the United States, for overconsumption and wastefulness. So if I look at this in a practical level, what does that look like? Practical tips. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a time in the early 70s where there was an electricity crisis and there's a big campaign to turn off the lights. So for me, I didn't realize that was actually a stewardship thing. Go figure, saving electricity. And you know what it also does? It saves money. Go figure. Another thing we're supposed to steward. So just think for a moment of how we use our food, our electricity, and our water. And just simple things of just turning off the tap or turning off the lights. Now, you might say, Mike, this sounds so simple. But it's these little simple, ordinary things of our obedience to be good stewards of the resources he's given us. Remember, he's given us creation to oversee and to take the benefit of what's in the ground, of what moves along the ground, of what's in the sea and what's in the air. And so how are we being stewards of that which God has entrusted to us? And I think about that as the ways of the practical tip of just doing a resource audit. How much food do I waste? How much electricity or water? Again, I'm not saying just to be so legalistic, but if we're aware of what it means to be a good steward, and I'll finish with this part. I think because of what many Christians sadly think about entitlement of the earth's resources, that in some way it feeds into this it's all for me philosophy. If I feel like, oh, I could just run the air conditioner because I paid for it at the hotel, we're not thinking about how that translates to other areas of our time, talents, and treasures to say, well, it's all for me. It's all about me. Now, again, as I'm saying this, I'm pointing fingers at myself. There are different times where I think like, I paid for that. I can keep the air running. And then I have to think about, is that really being a good steward? And then so, again, I have to work on that, believe me. And so a resource audit, how am I doing on these things? So when we look at stewardship again, is that act of using God's resources in a wise, diligent, loving, and just way. It's how we deal with our finances. It's how we deal with our talents, how we deal with our time, and how we deal with the natural resources that are around. Because we have to think about it. Does it belong to me or does it belong to God? Because really, the reality of it is, in our take-home truth, is that we're responsible for what God has entrusted to us. We're responsible for what God has entrusted to us. When God says, take care of something, we want to take care of it to the best of our ability, to present it to God, to say, here you go. This is what I've done with what you've given me. Here's what I've done with my money and my possessions. Here's what I've done with my gifts and skills and influence. Here's what I've done with my time. Here's what I've done with the resources, natural resources that you've given me from the earth. It's an act of worship, responsible stewardship. I want to finish with this, is that although it's not up on the screen, I think about the challenge for us is three different things when it comes to having a lifestyle of stewardship in these areas. The first is the awareness of our mind. We're challenged with the awareness of our mind. The very fact that God has called us to steward certain things and expects certain things from us. There's an awareness. Well, when we have the awareness of the mind, the second thing basically is the attitude of the heart. We see in the third servant, he didn't care. And many times we're tempted to say, why should I care? Why should I care about that? It's not just the awareness of the mind, it's the attitude of the heart, and thirdly, the action of the will. If I know about it, what's my attitude about it? And then what am I going to do about it? And so as I mention these things today, as we springboard from the parable of the talents, I want to recall what the Apostle Paul says. And you see that up on the screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2. Now it's required that those who've been given a trust must prove faithful. May it be said of us that we are good stewards of all that God has graciously entrusted to us, so that one day we would hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. Let's pray.